It was a normal Wednesday afternoon when Emily Carter's best friend, Megan, stopped by to check on her. Emily hadn't answered her calls or texts in over a day, which was strange for her. When Megan arrived, she found Emily's door slightly open. That's when she saw it. Emily was lying on the floor, lifeless. She immediately called the police, but it was already too late. Emily Carter, a 26-year-old woman full of life, had been trying to move on from a relationship that had turned sour. Her ex-boyfriend, Dylan Marks, couldn't accept their breakup. Dylan was 28, and while he seemed normal to those around him, his obsession with Emily had taken a dangerous turn. After they split, Dylan began following her, sending messages nonstop, and showing up uninvited. Emily's friends noticed that Dylan's behavior was getting worse, but no one thought it would end in a murder. Dylan had been growing more possessive every day. He couldn't handle seeing Emily live her life without him, and he became angry at the thought of her with anyone else. In his mind, if he couldn't have her, no one would. The last time Dylan saw Emily, things escalated quickly, leading to a violent confrontation. What happened that night wasn't just a crime of passion, it was the result of months of unhealthy obsession and ignored warning signs. The police quickly zeroed in on Dylan as the prime suspect. And soon, the truth of what really happened began to unravel. This story will reveal the events that led to Emily's tragic death and how Dylan's growing obsession turned deadly. Emily Carter was a 26-year-old woman who lived in a small apartment on the outskirts of town. She was full of life, always smiling and friendly with everyone. For most people who knew her, Emily seemed to have it all together. But behind her happy appearance, she was hiding something. Her ex-boyfriend, Dylan Marks, wouldn't leave her alone. They had broken up about a year ago, but Dylan refused to accept it. He kept coming back, finding new ways to contact her, showing up at her place, and sending messages, even though Emily had made it clear she wanted to move on. Dylan was 28, and when they first met, he seemed like the perfect guy. He was charming, funny, and thoughtful. Emily quickly fell for him, and they were happy together for the first few months. But over time, Dylan's behavior began to change. He became controlling and jealous. He would ask her where she was all the time, who she was talking to, and what she was doing. It started to make Emily uncomfortable, but she didn't know how to tell him without making him angry. She kept hoping things would go back to the way they were in the beginning, but instead, it got worse. One night, they had a huge fight after Dylan accused Emily of being unfaithful. Emily knew she had done nothing wrong, but Dylan was convinced she was seeing someone else. That night, Emily made up her mind to leave him for good. She told him she didn't want to be in a relationship where she felt trapped and controlled. Dylan didn't take it well. He begged her to stay, promising he would change, but Emily had heard it all before. She ended the relationship and thought that would be the end of it. However, Dylan couldn't let go. After they broke up, he kept texting her, calling her, and trying to get back into her life. At first, Emily tried to be kind. She responded to a few of his messages, hoping that he would move on if she was polite. But Dylan took her kindness as a sign that she might still want to be with him. When she finally stopped replying to his messages, he started showing up at her apartment unannounced. Emily was scared, but she didn't know what to do. She talked to her friends about it, and they all told her the same thing: block his number, don't answer the door, and stay away from him. Emily followed their advice and blocked Dylan on her phone and social media. For a while, it seemed like things were getting better. Dylan stopped trying to contact her, and Emily began to feel like she could finally breathe again. She focused on her job, spent time with her friends, and tried to move on with her life. But deep down, she still felt uneasy. There was always a part of her that feared Dylan might come back. One evening, after a long day at work, Emily came home to find a note on her door. It was from Dylan. He had written that he missed her, and that he just wanted to talk. Emily's heart sank. She hadn't seen or heard from him in months, and now here he was, leaving notes on her door. She didn't want to talk to him, but she was afraid of what might happen if she ignored him again. She took the note down, crumpled it up, and threw it away without reading the rest of it. That night, Emily called her best friend, Megan, and told her what had happened. Megan was worried. She had always thought Dylan was trouble, even when they were still together. Megan told Emily to be careful and offered to stay with her for a few days, but Emily declined. She didn't want to live in fear. She had blocked him, ignored his attempts to reach out, and hoped he would eventually move on. But as the days passed, the feeling that something was wrong continued to grow stronger. A few days after finding the note, Emily began noticing strange things. She would come home from work and find things slightly out of place in her apartment. A chair would be moved, a door she thought she had closed would be open, or her belongings would be in different spots. At first, she thought she was just imagining things. She had been stressed at work, and maybe she was just tired. But then, one night, she came home and found the door to her apartment slightly open. Her heart raced as she stood in the doorway, afraid to go inside. Emily immediately called Megan, who rushed over. Together they checked the apartment, but nothing seemed to be missing. Everything was there except for the feeling of safety Emily once had in her own home. Megan urged her to call the police, but Emily hesitated. What would she tell them? That her door was open and she thought her ex-boyfriend might be involved. There wasn't any proof. In the end, Emily decided not to call the police, but she couldn't shake the fear that Dylan was watching her. This marked the beginning of the nightmare that would soon unfold, as Emily's world became darker with each passing day. After Emily found her apartment door open, things only got worse. The strange occurrences continued, and each time she came home, she felt more and more unsafe. She couldn't shake the feeling that Dylan was somehow involved, but she had no proof. She didn't want to seem paranoid, and she still wasn't sure what to do. As days passed, her fear grew stronger. She didn't tell her family, not wanting to worry them, but Megan knew something was very wrong. They spoke almost daily, and Megan encouraged her to take extra precautions. Emily installed a security system in her apartment. She also changed the locks, hoping that this would finally bring her some peace of mind. For a short time, it seemed like everything might settle down. The days passed without incident, and Emily allowed herself to relax just a little. She had even started dating someone new, a man named James, who made her feel safe and cared for. She thought Dylan had finally let go, but Dylan hadn't let go. His obsession had only grown stronger. Emily didn't know it, but he had been watching her. He knew about James and was furious that she had moved on without him. For Dylan, Emily belonged to him, and the thought of her being with someone else filled him with rage. He began stalking her more intensely, following her and trying to find out more about her new relationship. His mind was filled with jealousy and anger, and he started plotting how to confront her. One night, Emily went out to dinner with James. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing evening, but as they were walking back to Emily's apartment, she saw someone across the street. It was Dylan. He wasn't trying to hide, he just stood there, staring at her. Emily felt a wave of fear wash over her, and she grabbed James's arm, telling him that they needed to leave quickly. They rushed inside her apartment and locked the door, but Emily's heart was racing. She knew now that Dylan hadn't moved on, and she was terrified about what he might do next. James stayed with her that night, and they talked about what had happened. He encouraged her to go to the police, but Emily wasn't sure. What would she say? That her ex-boyfriend was standing across the street. She felt trapped, knowing that Dylan was watching her, but unsure of how to protect herself. She hadn't told James everything about Dylan's past behavior, not wanting to drag him into her problems, but now she realized she might not have a choice. The next day, Emily did go to the police. She explained everything that had been happening, how Dylan wouldn't leave her alone, how he had been following her, and how she was afraid for her safety. The police took her report, but without any hard evidence, there wasn't much they could do. They told her to contact them if she saw Dylan again or if anything else happened. Emily left feeling frustrated and helpless. She had done what she thought was the right thing, but it didn't seem like enough. Meanwhile, Dylan's obsession continued to grow. He became more and more convinced that if he couldn't have Emily, no one else should. He spent hours thinking about their past, replaying every moment in his mind, and telling himself that she was the only person who had ever truly understood him. His anger toward James grew, and his thoughts became darker. A few weeks later, Emily was home alone. It was a quiet night, and she was starting to feel more at ease. She hadn't seen Dylan since that night outside her apartment, and she hoped that maybe he had finally given up. She was sitting on the couch, watching TV, when she heard a noise outside. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder. Someone was trying to open her door. Her heart started pounding, and she grabbed her phone, ready to call the police. But before she could dial, the door flew open. It was Dylan. He looked different, wild, angry, and desperate. Emily froze in shock, not knowing what to do. Dylan stormed into the apartment, shouting and accusing her of ruining his life. He ranted about how she had betrayed him, how she was supposed to be with him, and how she had no right to be with someone else. Emily tried to calm him down, but nothing worked. His mind was set. The argument quickly turned violent. Dylan grabbed Emily, pushing her against the wall. She tried to fight back, but he was too strong. In a rage, Dylan pulled a knife from his pocket. Emily's mind was racing. She knew she had to get out, but there was nowhere to go. She screamed for help, but no one came. Dylan was beyond reason, consumed by his anger and obsession. In that moment, Emily's life flashed before her eyes. She knew this was the end. In a final act of desperation, Dylan attacked her. The scene was brutal, and by the time it was over, Emily lay lifeless on the floor of her own apartment. Dylan, covered in blood, stood over her body for a moment, his breathing heavy. Then, as if realizing what he had done, he fled the apartment, leaving behind the horror he had just created. Emily's story didn't end there, though. What followed would be the beginning of a complex investigation that would eventually bring Dylan to justice. After Dylan fled the scene, Emily's apartment was left in silence. The once lively, safe space had turned into a crime scene, a place where a life had been taken in a fit of uncontrollable rage. Emily's body remained on the floor, and hours passed before anyone discovered the tragedy. Her friend Megan, who had been worried about her ever since Dylan started appearing again, tried to call her that evening. When Emily didn't answer, Megan's concern turned into fear. She knew something was wrong. Megan decided to go to Emily's apartment to check on her. She hoped she was just overreacting and that Emily was simply busy, but deep down, Megan sensed something far more serious had happened. When she arrived, the sight that awaited her was far worse than she could have imagined. The door was slightly open, just like the last time Emily had found it that way. But this time, when Megan stepped inside, she found her best friend lying on the floor, covered in blood. The shock was overwhelming, and Megan could barely comprehend what she was seeing. Megan immediately ran out of the apartment and called the police. She could hardly speak as she tried to explain the situation, her voice trembling as the horror of what had happened began to sink in. The police arrived quickly, securing the scene and starting their investigation. Emily's death had sent shockwaves through the quiet neighborhood. A young woman's life had been cut short, and now the authorities had the difficult task of piecing together the events that led to her murder. Detective Greg Harrison, a seasoned investigator with over 20 years of experience, was assigned to the case. He arrived at the scene with a focused, determined look. He had seen many crime scenes before, but there was something about this one that struck him. The violence was personal, targeted. It was clear to him from the start that Emily's death wasn't random. The way her body was positioned, the wounds inflicted, everything pointed to someone who knew her. The police began collecting evidence, searching for any clues that could lead them to the killer. They dusted for fingerprints, took photographs of the scene, and gathered anything that might provide insight into what had happened. As they worked, Megan sat outside the apartment, devastated and unable to process the loss of her friend. She kept thinking about Dylan, knowing in her heart that he was responsible for this. She told the officers about him, explaining how he had been stalking Emily for months, how he had refused to let her go. Megan's testimony gave the police their first real lead. Detective Harrison followed up on Megan's information and started looking into Dylan's background. It didn't take long to uncover a pattern of troubling behavior. Dylan had a history of volatile relationships, marked by jealousy and possessiveness. Several of his past girlfriends had reported similar problems, though none of them had escalated to the level of violence that Emily had endured. The deeper Detective Harrison dug into Dylan's life, the more convinced he became that Dylan was the one responsible for Emily's murder. The police issued a warrant for Dylan's arrest, and the manhunt began. Dylan had vanished after the murder, and no one seemed to know where he had gone. His phone had been turned off, and there were no signs of him at his apartment. The authorities began questioning his friends and family, hoping someone might have information about his whereabouts. Days passed without any major breakthroughs, and the case seemed to stall. Meanwhile, the community was in mourning. Emily's death had touched everyone who knew her, and the news of her murder spread quickly. People were shocked and saddened, but they were also afraid. The idea that someone could be so obsessed, so driven by jealousy, that they would take a life was terrifying. For many, it was a wake-up call about the dangers of obsessive relationships and the warning signs that often go ignored. As the police continued their search, they finally caught a break. One of Dylan's co-workers came forward with information. He had seen Dylan a few days after the murder, acting strangely and avoiding any conversations about what had happened to Emily. The co-worker provided the police with a location where he believed Dylan might be hiding, a small cabin in the woods, far from town, where Dylan had gone to clear his head in the past. With this new lead, the authorities prepared for the next step. They gathered a team and headed out to the cabin. As they approached, the tension was high. No one knew what to expect, but they were determined to bring Dylan in and hold him accountable for what he had done. When they reached the cabin, they found Dylan inside, alone and unarmed. He didn't resist when they arrested him, almost as if he had been expecting it. The man who had once been full of rage now seemed empty, defeated by his own actions. The arrest of Dylan Marks brought some relief to Emily's family and friends, but the road to justice was just beginning. The investigation was far from over, and the details of what had driven Dylan to commit such a horrific act would soon come to light. After Dylan Marks was arrested, the case quickly moved to the courtroom. The evidence against him was strong, and his connection to Emily's murder was clear. The community was still reeling from the news of her death, and many people followed the case closely, waiting for justice to be served. Dylan's trial became a major event not just for Emily's family and friends, but for the entire town. At the trial, the prosecution presented a detailed case. They outlined Dylan's obsessive behavior, starting from the moment his relationship with Emily ended. The prosecutors painted a picture of a man who couldn't accept that his ex-girlfriend had moved on. They described how Dylan's obsession grew over time, how he stalked Emily, sent her messages, and showed up at her apartment uninvited. They argued that his fixation had turned violent, ultimately leading to Emily's brutal murder. Megan, Emily's best friend, was called to testify. She described the months leading up to Emily's death, how Emily had been terrified of Dylan, and how she had tried to distance herself from him. Megan's testimony was emotional, and she struggled to hold back tears as she recounted the night she found Emily's body. Her words left a lasting impact on the jury, and it became clear just how much Emily had suffered in the final weeks of her life. The prosecution also presented evidence from the crime scene. The security footage from Emily's apartment building showed Dylan entering and leaving on the night of the murder. Fingerprints and DNA collected from the apartment matched Dylan's, and the knife used in the attack was traced back to him. It was a solid case, and the evidence left little room for doubt. Dylan's defense team tried to argue that his actions were not premeditated. They claimed that he had acted in a moment of rage, that he had been emotionally unstable, and that he had not planned to kill Emily. They presented Dylan as a man who had been struggling with his emotions and mental health, overwhelmed by the breakup and unable to control his actions. However, this argument didn't gain much traction. The prosecution countered by showing that Dylan's behavior had been escalating for months, that he had stalked Emily repeatedly, and that the murder had been the final act of his obsession. Throughout the trial, Dylan sat quietly in the courtroom, avoiding eye contact with anyone. His expression remained blank as witness after witness took the stand. He showed little emotion, even when graphic details of the crime were discussed. Some people in the courtroom found this lack of reaction unsettling, while others thought it was a sign of guilt. Detective Greg Harrison, the lead investigator on the case, also testified. He provided the jury with a clear timeline of events, explaining how the investigation had unfolded from the moment Megan called the police to the day Dylan was arrested. His testimony reinforced the prosecution's argument that Dylan's actions had been deliberate and planned. The detective emphasized the overwhelming amount of evidence that pointed to Dylan as the killer, leaving the jury with little doubt about who was responsible for Emily's death. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Dylan's defense was weak. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his behavior both before and after the murder painted a picture of a man who had been consumed by jealousy and anger. The prosecution argued that Dylan had planned the attack, that he had gone to Emily's apartment that night with the intention of confronting her, and that when she rejected him once again, he snapped. Emily's family attended every day of the trial, sitting quietly in the courtroom as they listened to the details of her final moments. They had been devastated by her loss, and now they were forced to relive the pain of her death through the testimony of witnesses and experts. It was an emotionally draining process, but they remained determined to see justice served. As the trial drew to a close, both the prosecution and defense delivered their final arguments. The prosecution reminded the jury of Dylan's obsessive behavior, the evidence that clearly pointed to him as the killer, and the pain he had caused Emily and her loved ones. They asked the jury to find Dylan guilty of first-degree murder, arguing that his actions were intentional and planned. The defense, on the other hand, asked the jury to consider the possibility that Dylan had acted impulsively. They argued that his mental state had played a role in the crime, and that he should be found guilty of a lesser charge. However, this argument seemed weak in the face of the evidence presented throughout the trial. After the final arguments, the jury was sent to deliberate. The courtroom was tense as everyone waited for a verdict. Emily's family and friends sat together, holding their breath, hoping that justice would be served. Hours passed, and the wait felt like an eternity. Finally, the jury returned to the courtroom with their decision. The judge read the verdict, and as the words were spoken, the weight of the entire trial seemed to settle over the room. The jury had found Dylan Marks guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict brought a sense of relief to Emily's family and friends, though the pain of losing her would never truly fade. Dylan Marks would spend the rest of his life in prison, but for those who loved Emily, the emotional scars of her death would remain. Dylan Marks was now a convicted murderer, facing life in prison without the possibility of parole. For many, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but for Emily's family and friends, the pain of her loss would never fully heal. The trial had been difficult for everyone involved, and while justice had been served, the emotional toll was heavy. Emily's mother, father, and close friends tried to move forward, but it wasn't easy. The memories of Emily were everywhere, from the photos on their walls to the little things in their daily lives that reminded them of her. The realization that she was gone forever was something they would have to live with, and each day brought new challenges in coping with the grief. Megan, who had been so close to Emily, struggled the most with the guilt of not being able to protect her friend. She kept thinking back to the signs, wondering if there was something more she could have done to stop Dylan before it was too late. Even though she had testified in court and helped bring Dylan to justice, Megan couldn't shake the feeling that she had failed her best friend. She sought counseling, trying to process the trauma of finding Emily's body and dealing with the aftermath of such a horrific event. As Dylan began his life behind bars, details of his past behavior continued to emerge. Several women from his past came forward, sharing stories of his obsessive and controlling nature. They told of how he would manipulate and intimidate them, and how they, too, had feared what he might be capable of. These stories painted an even clearer picture of the dangerous man Dylan had become. It was now obvious that his actions toward Emily had been building for a long time, fueled by years of unresolved issues and an inability to handle rejection. For the town where the crime took place, Emily's murder served as a harsh reminder of the dangers that can come from obsessive relationships. People began talking more openly about the warning signs of controlling behavior, and many hoped that Emily's story would encourage others to seek help if they found themselves in similar situations. The community organized events in her memory, with the goal of raising awareness about domestic violence and stalking. Her death became a symbol of the importance of paying attention to those subtle signals that something might be wrong. Meanwhile, Detective Greg Harrison continued his work, focusing on other cases. While he had been satisfied with the outcome of the trial, he knew that the scars left behind by crimes like this one never truly fade. He had seen too many cases where lives were shattered by violence, and Emily's murder had been particularly difficult because of how preventable it seemed. The detective remained haunted by the thought that if someone had intervened earlier, if more people had recognized Dylan's behavior for what it was, maybe Emily could have been saved. The case also changed how local law enforcement approached cases of stalking and harassment. The police department worked to implement stricter measures for dealing with obsessive ex-partners and provided more resources for victims of stalking. They wanted to prevent another tragedy like Emily's from happening again, and Detective Harrison was a strong advocate for these changes. He believed that while the law had caught up with Dylan, there needed to be more done to prevent such cases from escalating to the point of violence. Dylan, now alone in prison, had plenty of time to reflect on his actions, but even as he sat behind bars, it was unclear whether he truly understood the impact of what he had done. To him, his obsession with Emily had been all-consuming, and it had led him down a path from which there was no return. His time in prison stretched ahead of him with no hope of release, and while justice had been served in a legal sense, the emotional wreckage left behind could never be fully repaired. As years passed, Emily's family and friends continued to honor her memory. Her parents established a scholarship in her name, hoping to help young women achieve their dreams just as Emily had wanted to. Megan found strength in helping others who had experienced similar trauma, channeling her grief into advocacy work. She spoke out at events, shared her story, and became a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. She knew that nothing could bring Emily back, but if her story could save even one life, it would be worth the pain she had endured. The town eventually returned to a sense of normalcy, but Emily's story remained a constant reminder of the fragile nature of life and how quickly everything can change. People continued to talk about what had happened, and her murder left a lasting mark on the community. Her name was not forgotten, and her story served as a powerful lesson about the dangers of unchecked obsession and the importance of recognizing the signs before it was too late. The case of Dylan Marks and Emily Carter became one of those tragic stories that people would talk about for years to come. It was a story of love turned toxic, of control and obsession that spiraled into violence, and of a life lost too soon. The emotional aftermath of Emily's murder would linger long after the court had closed its files, but her memory would continue to live on through the people who loved her and the lessons they had learned from her tragic end.